معلش لأول مرة أزعل منه كثير مو شوي كان في باك اب يحتاج باك اب which I don't think that I will.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first MENA Energy Economics Conference that is organized jointly by the Institute of Financial Economics at AUB, by the UN ESCWA, and by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. As the world transitions to cleaner, more sustainable energy systems, the MENA countries are also experiencing major changes in their own energy markets, triggered by the need to diversify their energy mix and, in some cases, to augment the share of exported oil that will impact their development, industrialization strategies, and energy policies. Another important development that is of relevance to the region as a whole is the recent potential discovery of oil and gas offshore fields in countries such as Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon, and potential shale oil and gas in Algeria. We will discuss these issues and more at the conference. Also, some selected papers will be published in a special issue of the prestigious journal Energy Policy. I am thankful for the help I got from the co-organizers, Radia Sidawi, Ms. Radia Sidawi, Dr. Bassam Fatouh, and Dr. Ibrahim Jamali, and grateful to the numerous experts who have come to share their knowledge at this event. Ladies and gentlemen, again, it's a delight to see you all here at AUB. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests from abroad. And at this point, I will give the floor to Ms. Rula Majdalani.
She's here.
Yeah.
I was looking at her.
Representing ESCWA, who would like to say a welcoming word. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. Good morning. I certainly don't have a speech, but it's really an honor for me to be part of this very important and very timely conference, and that brings together distinguished speakers, but also allows for bringing the international organizations who have been leading an ambitious process for moving towards sustainable development. And energy is at the core of this debate on sustainable development, sustainable energy. And for our region, this is something very important because as much as we talk about renewable energy, alternative energies, but oil and gas remains at the center. Yesterday, we had a meeting of a group of experts affiliated to the Intergovernmental Committee on Energy as part of ESCWA intergovernmental processes. And Dr. Fatouh brought a very interesting point to the floor. As countries are moving towards more diversification or adopting or looking at strategies of diversification, that should not mean that we're moving away from oil and gas, but repositioning it to make the link much closer with social and economic development. And I think with that, this is something that we converge. We're very happy to cooperate with leading academic institutions, leading thinkers, and with the UN being also a good convener that brings together policymakers from the region and leverage this to the global platform to work towards sustainable development. So I would like to welcome you all on behalf of ESCWA, thank my colleagues, led by Ms. Radia Sidawi, who has led this process, and thank all the colleagues from also ESCWA, the Oxford University, AUB, who have done every effort to bring this together. Thank you.
I will give the floor to Dr. Bassam Fatouh, Director of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. He will be moderating the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leila. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bassam Fatouh. I'm the Director of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. I'm also professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. But most importantly, I'm also a graduate at AUB, so it's really a double joy to be here. And it's really a privilege and honor to be sharing this keynote, oil price dynamics. And the Lebanese flags have arrived as well, so that is a success. So we can take the pictures now. So shall we? Okay. That's fantastic. So it's really a privilege and honor to be sharing this keynote panel. The title of this keynote panel is Oil Price Dynamic and the Transition of the Energy System. What are some of the implications for Arab countries? Now, the term energy transition has perhaps become one of the most widely used in the literature and in the popular discourse. Unfortunately, it means different things to different people, but one common thread concerns the shift to a low-carbon economy through changing the energy mix or using energy more efficiently and sustainably. While there is recognition that energy demand will continue to increase due to improvement in incomes, wider development, there is a strong push across the world that the carbon intensity of the sources of energy should be reduced. Therefore, the energy transition that I think is already started is already leading to structural changes in the energy markets around the globe. And given the dominant position of the Arab world in the hydrocarbons market, this creates really massive challenges for both actually exporters and importers alike. For oil exporting countries with proved reserve to production ratio of multiple decades, they face the challenge of monetizing their large reserve base, but most importantly, the risk of losing their export revenues, which could disrupt their socioeconomic well-being, given their high reliance on oil revenues. And given the economic and trade linkages between Arab oil exporters and oil importers, this will also create challenges for oil importers. Therefore, some of the key questions that we're going to be trying to address in this session is how should oil exporting countries position themselves in the transition era? How can they speed the diversification process to ensure long-term sustainability and improve their resilience? What policies oil exporters could adopt to ensure that demand for hydrocarbon is sustained into the future? How can they take advantage of the renewables revolution to create new sectors in the economy? What are the risks for the global economy and for the oil exporters if that transition does not proceed smoothly, which many people are expecting? So to answer some of these questions, I'm very delighted to have with us 4 prominent panelists. Let me introduce them at the start, and then I'll give them the floor. Ms. Radia Sidawi is the Chief of the Energy Section in the Sustainable Development Policies Division of UN Economic Social Commission West Asia, ESQA, since 1st of February 2016. Dr. Majid Al-Munif is a leading expert on Gulf and Middle Eastern economies and energy markets. Dr. Adnan Shahabuddin is former Acting Secretary General and Director of the Research Division of OPEC and is currently the Director General of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences since 2011. And last but not least, Professor Giacomo Luciani is a coordinator of the Executive Master in Oil and Gas Leadership at the Graduate Institute, Geneva. He is also Scientific Director of the Master in International Energy at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po, and he has many, many publications on the issues of diversification, the resource curves, and rentier theory. The plan for today is to give the floor to each of our panelists to make their introductory remarks, and then we will start the debate. And towards the end, I would really encourage to take some questions. I would, to receive some questions from the floor. So I gave each panelist around 6 to 7 minutes to make their introductory remarks on these topics. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor first to Dr. Majid Al-Munif to reflect on how he sees the energy landscape evolving and how he sees Arab oil exporters adjusting to the new challenges and opportunities, perhaps drawing from some of examples from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries.
Thank you. Thank you, Bassam. I'd like first to thank Leila Dagher and the Institute of Financial Economics for inviting me to this conference. I'd like also to thank the other organizers of this conference, bringing us back to this beautiful city, ever busy city. Back in the 60s or so, it was a major city where so many things were happening, even in the energy arena. So I'm glad that the city and the AUB is reclaiming the lead in this undertaking the energy issues. On the energy transitions, as Bassam has rightly said, it has been a focal point of analysis the past 2 or 3 years. But what is absent from the analysis, or a different, say, narrative, true energy demand has been, the growth in energy demand has been declining. Energy efficiency has been increasing. Renewable energies has been on the rise. Its economics has improved drastically, and its share in the global energy mix has been increasing drastically. Mobility has been going tremendous changes the past few years with the improving economics of the electric car, the new mobilities, and so on. But what's absent from, and of course you've got the climate change. But what's absent is that the other transition is that since 2013, the developing countries has commanded the lead in oil demand. Now the share of the developing countries is higher than the share of the OECD in global oil demand, and it's continuing like this. Not only that, it's something like 85 or 90% of the incremental of the growth in oil demand is attributed to the developing countries. So this is continuing. So most of the growth in energy and in oil demand, in gas demand, is really originating from the developing countries. And this fact has been largely overlooked. The other one that has been overlooked, that even in the developing countries, that the renewable option is not only that of the OECD anymore. Most of the developing countries, now the leading country in solar power generation is China. The leading country, 80% of the panels are produced worldwide, produced in China. So even the developing countries are in the lead in that renewable energy. Not only that, I would add that even our countries, oil and gas producing countries, they have their own renewable programs, very ambitious renewable programs in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Indonesia, in Algeria, and elsewhere. So we're part of that transition. We are not just waiting for that transition to happen to respond, but we want to be part of that transition worldwide. Last but not least, we are also, all our countries now they are signatories to the Paris Accord, and we already submitted our index, and we are committed on our energy efficiency programs, renewable programs, and our energy price reform programs. We'll continue in that path. So this is a new dimension to the narrative of energy transitions, that our countries, they don't want to be just a witness to the transition, but part of that transition. I've got some other points on the notion of peak oil demand and its impact on our countries, and if and when peak oil demand happens, what would be the policies of our countries to the eventuality of that happening sometime in the future, beyond 2040 or 2050 or before, and so on, but we probably will get back to that later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Majid. That was actually is quite encouraging that you see the Arab world is actually being part of the energy transition, and you see that they are taking a role in leading role in in some of the things that are happening around, particularly in the renewables. But let me now give the floor to Dr. Adnan, because Dr. Majid mentioned the peak oil demand and when it happens. The question that many people ask, is that something that we can do to lengthen the life of oil, basically to make it more acceptable for the outside, so we can actually, rather than it peaking in 2040, actually we can extend its life?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be at AUB, and I would like to thank the organizers too, ESQA and Layla Dagher and the Institute of Finance Economics here in AUB. I would answer your question, Bassam, by just prefacing first to emphasize what Majid mentioned. It is clear that the direction of this structural energy transition, where we are heading. We're heading to tackle not only energy security issues that used to dominate the debate 40 years ago, 20 years ago, but we are now shifting without giving up the energy security as the main driver, but also we are shifting to how we address climate change challenges. And of course, security and climate change challenges dictating a direction for the energy transition, which is to move toward low carbon energy sources. And that move, as Dr. Majid described, luckily, we are playing a part of it. And what I would like to emphasize is we should not just simply take part in it, but when it comes to oil and gas, which is really has been the dominant economic driver in this region, we really take the leading part in making those energy resources consistent with the direction of this energy transition. For the two reasons you mentioned, Bassam, you mentioned that we need to think about diversification, but also to optimize our resources. You cannot drive economic growth by focusing only on one thing, by focusing on moving away from oil and gas. We should be moving to diversify from oil and gas, but also to optimize the returns from oil and gas, and that's what we're going to focus on in response to your question. We need to think, how can we lead this transition to make oil and gas low carbon? And sometimes this appears as a dilemma, but it isn't. Oil and gas already, in many parts of the world, is being converted to low carbon, not zero carbon yet, but low carbon. Of course, gas, by definition, is better than oil when it comes to carbon quality. Oil is better than coal. But their use, these two primary energy sources, their use is different. One is mainly for the power sector, one is mainly for the transportation sector. In the power sector, globally, there is a movement to move to carbon capture and utilization and storage to make natural gas even more efficient in terms of carbon. People can think even zero emission. And we should play a leading role, rather than just simply a users and followers, which means that we have to play a role in technology development, not just simply use the latest technologies for capture. And we haven't been leading in carbon capture, we have been actively participating. maybe not necessarily at the level that is consistent with the size of resources we have. If you look at the Arab countries, you're talking more than 50, close to 60% of the oil and gas resources, perhaps, at least the conventional ones, are sitting in our part of the world. And therefore, by definition, we should be playing more than 50% of the technology development, and we are not doing that. So that's on the capture side. On the oil and the use of oil in the transportation sector, it's quite difficult to think that attaching to every car a carbon capture, and where do you store it, even if you capture it? But here we have to be imaginative. We have to be thinking ahead. There are technologies that can link the use of oil in the transportation sector with making, in totality, zero emission by capturing the CO2 ahead of the use of the oil in the cars and the transportation sector. And I'm making this because there is a very strong drive, it's already taking place, to switch from using liquids, hydrocarbon liquids, in cars, in vehicles, in favor of electricity or electric vehicles, regardless of what is the source of the energy. That move is moving by policy, governments in the West, because of local pollution and because of climate change drivers. Now, it is not inconceivable, and it's already at the demonstration stage, that you are able to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. And for each barrel of oil, you could think of 20 or 30 or 40 years in the future, for each barrel of oil that you're exporting, you have already captured an equivalent amount of the CO2 content of that barrel of oil, and you stored it, and you took a credit for it, and you can do that at an advantage to everyone else. Why? Because it's well known that the Middle East oil is the cheapest to extract. So if there is a penalty to compensate for the cost of capturing CO2, we will be the least penalized. And therefore, we have the most incentives to play the role of developing that technology. And I will close my initial remarks by saying I'm not talking theoretical. There are already pilot plants on the ground that capturing CO2 and putting it underground. There's one in Switzerland for completely different reasons. There's a plant in Switzerland, small one, capture CO2 from the atmosphere, not to put it underground, but to sell it to a company commercially. They make money out of it. So they sell it because there's a company nearby that needs CO2 and they don't want to bring it from far away, which is too costly. But it costs them about $300, $400 per tons of CO2. There is another venture. The first one is called Climate Work, by the way, if you're interested in following it. The second one, there is a group led by a Harvard professor who invented a new way of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, and he's funded by none others than the famous entrepreneur Bill Gates, who led Microsoft. This is called carbon engineering. I will close because I'm just touching on something where I believe that for 50 years or 60 years, we, the major producers of oil and gas, we ended up just using the technologies that were developed in the rest of the world. And yet we have 50 or 60% of the oil and gas resources. If there is a move to move away from oil as a main emitter of CO2, the world will need oil. It was mentioned that the developing countries need oil. I mean, you still talk about 2040, we need oil of about somewhere between 110 in the central scenarios, 100, 110. In the extreme scenarios of a Paris, to meet the Paris climate change, you're talking about 70 million barrels. And that scenario is almost an extreme scenario. It's not likely to happen easily. But regardless, the direction is there. We don't know exactly which angle that direction. We're not so sure about the speed. So I cannot say that in 2040 or 2050 there will be peak demand on oil. But there will be peak demand on oil that emits CO2. If you can make oil and gas compensate for the CO2 that it emits, you can extend the lifetime of oil and gas almost infinity.
Thank you, Adnan, for those comments. Before I give the floor to Radi, actually, I would like to follow up on why do you think, given, as you say, the size of the reserves that we have in the region, why we are not leading in a way on the technological development? What are the barriers for us to do those things? Why all of this innovation is happening outside?
Well, the main reason, it's obvious, is that traditionally our oil and gas industry was not indigenous traditionally. It was imported. It was started by the Seven Sisters, and then it was nationalized, and then the focus was on the efficiency of production and securing the demand by the rest of the world. Technological or investment in technology development in the upstream and downstream started some 20, 30 years ago in some of our countries. I think Saudi Arabia is one of the leaders in this, whether it's Aramco, whether are some of the universities like University of King Fahd and KAUST now, KAPSARC. So we were late in starting to invest in R&D. Still, most of our investment is to optimize and make the processes more efficient. Our investment in fundamentals and technology development is less lacking. Oil and gas industry in general invest the least in technology development when you compare it to other technologies. I mean, pharmaceutical, they invest 10% of sales. The industry itself, not the government. IT companies, they invest about 8% of sales. Oil and gas in the world itself, they invest less than 1% of sales. So traditionally, the whole sector is not a good investor in technology development, but in our part of the world, that's even much less than that. I think the demand or the pressure on using the revenues for infrastructure development, on social welfare, distributing the wealth through inefficient wealth distribution techniques that we are suffering from, all of this received more priority than investing in technology development. We're seeing the shift that's taking place. Just give you a simple number. 15% of the energy-related CO2 emissions is coming from the oil and gas extraction conversion, but not the use. The use is the rest. So if you can save in that 15%, reducing the flare, capturing, making the whole processes efficient, you already have a potential to save 15%. So I go back to your question, we need to invest more. We are seeing that, but we need to double or triple that.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan. Radia, from your view, how do you see this transition to low carbon, emerging in the Arab world? Are you that optimistic that we are moving in the right direction?
Thank you very much, Bassam, and I would like to thank the members of the panels, and it's always a pleasure meeting you at different events, especially the Arab Energy Club that we meet hopefully this week. Actually, talking about the topic of moving to a clean, would say, fossil fuels, or let's say clean economy, basically, from my perspective, rather than talking about energy security and clean carbon, I prefer to talk about energy vulnerability. That is a common concept that I believe it's for whether you are oil and gas producing countries or we are talking about consuming countries. And from our work, we identify that if we take the Arab region, basically, the mode and the business model that we followed, considering, as I said, Dr. Adnan, the social benefit, distribution of wealth in a way of providing education at any cost, but also ensure that all citizens have energy at the lowest cost. Basically, this kind of, I would say, strategies made that we produced, and we were dependent on fossil fuels, not only in our economy in terms of consumer countries, but also in terms of revenues from producer perspective. So the combination of all these elements made us today, specifically that it's the energy vulnerability, it's a multifaceted aspect for all the countries independently of producer and consumer. And today, I don't know when we talk about the transition, we focus on oil and gas producing countries only. I mean, all the countries are responsible when it comes to clean the economy, and we cannot, I would say, consider moving over the coming, I would say, century without fossil fuel. As long as the resources, whether fossil fuels or solar and wind exist, the resources are there. The human being need to invest in technology in order to make it clean. So to make it clean, as I said, the responsibility of all, but you need to have the enabling factors. For this, in addition to the technology, and Dr. Adnan is much more experienced than me in this field, you have other enabling factors that we need to work on them. The market structure needs completely review. When it comes to the domestic market, as a matter of fact, not only talking about subsidies, but I prefer to talk about rationalization of the prices of energy. How to ensure that we have a mechanism, not only to, I would say, to give the energy at the price that people can afford, but ensure that we are talking about reliability, access to modern energy at, I would say, affordable price, and to make it sustainable over the time. This is a concept that came up with the UN 2030 agenda, and basically I think the transition came as a platform for everybody, whether you are holding revenues or not. It's, I mean, whether you are producing or consuming, it's a common concept that everybody need to have moved to a sustainable, I would say, energy future that will build a sustainable development future for all future generations. So the other element maybe that was addressed as well, to move to a clean carbon, from our perspective is also, in addition to the market structure, you need also the market sector. It's not only about rationalization of prices, but also the involvement of private sector, and also review completely the financial system that allow that the private sector have enough incentive to invest when it comes to the diversity of the economy, and to invest in making the fuel much more cleaner and reduce the carbon. And that's why one of the elements for carbon capture storage and utilization is the legal framework, how to make the private sector, financial institutions all to work together, make incentive to have it work. And the other aspects when it comes to economic diversification, the economic diversification, it is for producers and consumers. I would say it's a question of talking about energy productivity. This is what I like as a concept, because what we have done during I would say, in our economy over the last, I would say, 3 decades, the producers of oil and gas, I'm coming from producing countries, so I don't consider that we have done too much effort in terms of when you produce, basically you are not getting any value from your oil and gas, but the real effort how to create jobs and to make this economics work. And for this also, if you are a consuming country, so how, if you continue using fossil fuels, so how you can invest and ensure that, yes, you create jobs, but also you create a clean economy, but you make value of this. And I would say that at the end of the day, one of the elements in Arab region it's missing is the regional collaboration and cooperation. Development of the oil and gas resources and working, I would say, for the clean economy cannot be possible if we don't collaborate on research, if we don't collaborate in the market, and several resources, including where we are in Lebanon, the host country, talking the Middle East gas, it cannot be possible without collaboration. And for this, I think there is food for talk, I think, but I wanted to finish by this. Thank you.
Thank you, Radia, and thank you for highlighting the issue of regional cooperation, collaboration on more than one front. I would like now to give the floor to Professor Giacomo. Giacomo, I'm going to give you actually a more challenging question as usual. Not because I like you very much, but that's why I give you a very challenging question. You have covered a lot the oil exporting countries, the political economy of the rent, distribution, circulation. How do you see this, being impacted by the energy transition? Are you worried about the political economy model that we are used to crumbling, or actually you're not that bothered about the energy transition?
Thank you, Bassam. Thank you for the challenging question. I always like to take challenges. And the great problem in discussing the energy transition is that on the one hand, we have the Paris Agreement, we have increasing awareness, at least apparently, about the issue of global warming. But on the other hand, we are not doing what needs to be done in order to face this challenge. So the commitments that individual countries have taken at the Paris conferences do not add up to a plan to decarbonize or meet the Paris Agreement. So this discrepancy between what we think needs to be done and what is actually being done is growing. So it very much depends on whether you believe that at some point humanity will repent and change its course and seriously pursue decarbonization, or whether you are looking at it from the point of view what is happening. What is happening in reality is that CO2 emissions are growing, demand for oil is growing, production of oil is growing, and it is extremely difficult to come up with a narrative that would lead us to think that there will be a peak in oil demand anytime soon. In fact, you know, even in the new policy scenario of the International Energy Agency, there is no peak in oil demand between now and 2040. After 2040, you know, we'll see. It is a banality, of course, to say that at some point in time there will be a peak in oil demand as there will be a peak in oil supply. I mean, that is, but when? So I've been asking myself, what kind of narratives can we come up in terms of justifying a possible peak? And of course, I will present three main alternatives to you. The first alternative is high prices. Let's assume that for some reason, and I will discuss the reason, the price of oil increases significantly. We know that the demand for oil is rigid in the short term, but it is not rigid in the medium to long term. It responds to oil. So if the price of oil is too high, demand will be destroyed. And it is conceivable that a high price for oil would lead to a decline in oil demand. How can a high price of oil come about? I offer you three alternatives. The first I would call OPEC greed, or producers' greed, you know, an attempt, a successful attempt on the part of the producers to jack prices up, as they have attempted to do in the past. History tells us that generally these attempts do not last very long and are undermined by a response from the market. The market responds, you see. You always have shocks, but then the market responds. And it responds in two ways, with a slowdown in demand and especially with a fast increase in supply, which is what we are seeing today. You know, the United States added 2 million barrels year on year of oil, of hydrocarbon liquids in this past year. So, you know, OPEC may decide to cut 1 million barrels. In 6 months' time, they are back on need to cut again, because the United States will have added another 1 million barrels. So it is difficult but it is conceivable that oil prices may be jacked up, and this may lead to a destruction in demand. The second possibility is what I would call international oil companies' suicide. The international oil companies are being influenced by public opinion, by their shareholders, by calls for them to abandon oil, invest less, return cash to their investors. And basically, this is what the International Energy Agency and Fatih Birol are worried about. They are telling us all the time, companies are not investing enough, and we may have a spike in prices in the next decade. So if international oil companies continue to look at their future with bleak eyes and underinvest, maybe this can come about. And the third possibility for high prices is that we finally agree on the only, in my opinion, sensible policy for decarbonization, which is imposing a carbon tax or a high price for carbon emissions. If you do that, of course, oil is not the most affected fossil fuel source, and you open the door to everything that Adnan Dr. Adnan has been talking about, in other words, carbon capture and reutilization, that would have a commercial, sufficient commercial justification to be pursued in a big way, decarbonization of oil production, and so on. So that would not necessarily be a negative scenario for oil-producing countries. And as a matter of fact, most international oil companies are in favor of a carbon tax. But governments are not pursuing it, and talk to Macron and ask him what happens when you try to impose taxes on fuels. Then there is another line of thinking, which I would call the Kodak moment. There is a line of thinking that says oil demand will peak because we found something better. If we found something better, and that's the electric car, and electric cars are superior. Now, all discussions about the superiority of electric cars, even in terms of emissions, are based on assumptions that are questionable at best. And producing an electric car is more expensive than producing an internal combustion engine car, and generates more emissions. The emissions generated by producing a Tesla are quite significantly higher than those that you generate producing a normal car. So all conclusions, all estimates about electric cars being better are contingent on, number one, assuming very high mileage per year for the car. I've seen Rocky Mountain Institute in one paper assumes that the car will travel 70,000 miles per year. 70,000 miles per year, that's 110 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers per year. It's about 300 kilometers per day. Are you driving 300 kilometers per day? Who's driving 300 kilometers per day and is, except for professional...
Depends where you are.
Wow. Come on. So I tend to be skeptical about the Kodak moment and about the penetration of electric vehicles, especially at the global level. It may happen in some cities. It may happen in China because the government can impose lots of things to its people, but not everywhere. And then there is the last hypothesis, and the last hypothesis is that we adopt regulations of some kind, new rules, in order to force people to abandon cars and abandon the internal combustion engine, even against their will. Okay, so this will not be a market decision; it will be a forced decision. As we have seen, some European countries have passed legislation that will impose all vehicles, new vehicles, to be electric by 2040, and so on and so forth. This is conveniently far away in time. And I dare say, let's wait and see what happens when the deadline approaches, whether democratic societies will support this tendency or not. I have the impression that the environmental agenda, climate change, has been proposed as being a obvious and convenient and even economic choice, hiding all the costs that are involved. And in fact, it has not been accepted by the vast majority of the voters, and when it comes up as a significant item in political discussion in elections, we see a backlash. We see a populist response, which we may regret. I regret it in many ways, because I'm convinced that climate change is a problem, a very serious problem. But when we look at it from the point of view of social scientists, we have to accept that it exists, and that's how things are evolving. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Giacomo, for the very useful insights. Let me follow with Dr. Majid on one of the points that Giacomo raised, is this idea that producers need a high oil price. Because what we see is that their reliance on revenues, on oil revenues, has really not decreased over the time. Actually, it has increased. And what we're seeing in many of the countries that they need a higher and higher oil price for their expenditures, for basically their economies to work. Isn't that a risk, that by pursuing such policies, that we can speed the energy transition? How can we reconcile the fact that those Arab economies need a higher oil price at the same time that with a higher oil price we're going to likely to see demand responses, supply responses, and government policy responses?
Thank you. You put it in a nicer way than Giacomo. Giacomo says greedy. You said over-dependence, and I think this is the critical point. The countries, if you look historically, the world is becoming less and less dependent on oil. Like energy intensity, oil intensity has been declining worldwide. But in our economies, energy intensity has been on the rise, and fiscal and economic dependence on oil has been on the increase. Now this is called elsewhere like the resource curse or the oil curse and so on. But it should not be a destiny that you're dependent, I will continue to be dependent. I think our countries should have embarked on economic adjustment programs to lessen dependence on oil. Because they did not do that, that's why it looks as if they want higher price. But you have to take that into, say, historical context. For example, our countries prior to 2013, 2014, needed higher price to balance the budgets. Need a lot higher than today. But after we, at least I know about Saudi Arabia, but I'm sure all other countries have gone through economic adjustment programs. We have reined on our government expenditure. We have reformed our energy prices, increased our prices drastically. We have made a few other adjustments. Of course, we've adopted also renewal programs and so on. Now, the so-called break-even price in the year 2018 is going to be a lot less than it used to be, say, in 2014. And I think all countries should be doing that. It is not the way we would like the price to be, but now it is less. So, true, our countries are dependent on oil, still too dependent on oil, and that's probably why they are not too comfortable with a price of 50 or 40 anymore. It's not greedy, but actually it's over dependence that we don't like it to be, because that's, I've heard the word greedy, elsewhere, not in this kind of gathering, but it is because we are over dependent on oil. This is the only source of government revenue, the only source of our trade balance and so on. So over-dependence is a disease. It's something that we have to work on. We have to lessen dependence on.
Dr. Adnan, you've always made the point that producer countries should actually take care of the oil price, and that's why you've been advocating that they not only work when prices are going down, but also try to control the price on the upside. But that actually requires investment in spare capacity and basically being more proactive. But at the time when the world is changing, where, for instance, President Trump and the US are, trying to pass the OPEC bill, which is more like, which is going to basically make it very difficult for them to be able to do that role. How do you see producers, being more proactive on the upside?
Well, obviously, the simple model that's used by OPEC in the past has been challenged because OPEC has focused mostly on making decisions rather than on being ready for the leadership it's required from it. Let me explain what I mean by that. I mean, if you want to play the leading role in the future of oil, regardless whether we're talking about oil in terms of supply-demand balance and the appropriate price that is you wish to have, or whether you are trying to take the leadership in making oil cleaner, and I'm going to put this aside. You said it yourself, everybody knows it, you have to have spare capacity to be able to control. If the market demands more oil, you ought to be willing to put that spare capacity if you want to take the leadership. OPEC has done that for a long time, sometimes very successful, sometimes not very successful, and the reason for that is OPEC is a intergovernmental organization, and they sit around the table and they negotiate not only oil but other things, other idiosyncrasies they bring to the table. But in general, the leadership of Saudi Arabia of OPEC, which is an acknowledged fact by everybody, kind of helped, and Saudi Arabia took upon itself, with the assistance of some of the Gulf countries, to try to always to have a 2 million barrels spare capacity, 2.5 million real one, not de facto one from shutting off some of the oil facilities. But nowadays, most of the OPEC countries are not willing to do that. And I think, and even in Saudi Arabia, there are pressures. I'm not so sure to speak on behalf of Saudi Arabia, Majid can elaborate, but there are pressures about how far really we should invest to do that leadership. But reality is, if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it for you. And we are right now witnessing a de facto leadership from shale, not because of individual shale producers produced an organization that is competing with OPEC, but because of the characteristic of shale. Shale being a production that can easily be invested in within a year, even sometimes less than a year, you get results. And if the price of oil goes up, the investors mobilize, the operators mobilize funds, put them to work, produce oil within the list. Giacomo said that year on year, last year, 2 million barrels was brought on the market. That's because OPEC and Russia and other non-OPEC succeeded in stabilizing the prices by making the cuts of about 1.5 million approximately. But immediately the response, and it was anticipated. It was not a secret, it was not a surprise. Everybody who follows this thing expected it to happen, it happened. So you really have to have a long-term strategy. A long-term strategy of investing, and investing in what? Investing in the low-cost oil. Because almost all of OPEC, with the exception of few on the periphery, almost all of OPEC oil is a low-cost oil. You can produce it at a profit around $10 maximum, maybe less in some countries, maybe $15. So the rest is your margin to drive your social and economic things. So I think my answer to you is very simple. OPEC and oil producers have to make that decision. Now we're seeing within OPEC friction taking place. I don't know whether this is a reflection of the times we are living in. It used to be that OPEC always managed to take the right decision, even if two countries within OPEC are fighting each other. That was the case in the 80s and 70s and 90s. They will differ, they will have tension, but they will come to the table and take decisions. I don't know whether we will be able to do that, but I think now the pressure is even more than before. Because not only now we are faced with balancing the market, supply and demand, and we have to invest in spare capacity, but we have to make the oil cleaner and things like that. So, bottom line, invest in spare capacity and have a policy within OPEC to do that. And I'm afraid, based on my experience in OPEC, that's not an easy thing to do, if not an impossible.
Giacomo, I agree with you that the uncertainty about peak demand is very, very high, and the energy sector, the oil and gas sector in the Arab countries will continue to be the dominant sector. But what are some of the things that actually we can change in the way that we manage this sector, so it can create the forward linkages, the backward linkages, that actually it can help those economies diversify and move on more and more towards, to be prepared for the energy transition. Because I'm assuming basically you're not saying that those Arab oil exporters, since demand is going to be there, they should not be doing anything. I'm sure this is not your approach.
No, as you know, I don't believe in the resource curse. I don't believe that having resources is a curse at all. And I also believe that some, at least, of the oil-producing countries have made tremendous progress towards economic diversification and the changing of their economies, Saudi Arabia being one, very obviously. So the issue is not diversification, which is, in my opinion, successfully happening in a time horizon which is what you would expect. Diversification does not happen overnight. It needs several decades. In my view, you can say that producing countries have ahead of themselves another 30, 40 years of producing oil at significant levels, and that can fuel a diversification process that by that time will be very advanced. The problem is fiscal policy. The problem is weaning the government budget away from oil revenue. That is where the problem lies. It is perfectly possible to devote oil revenue to investment, but not to recurrent government expenditure. Recurrent government expenditure should progressively be funded with other fiscal tools, with other taxes. Now, we know that there is a resistance to taxation, especially income taxation, in many countries. It's natural resistance, but you have to bite the bullet and introduce, I would say, all the necessary political changes in order to make taxation, including direct taxation, feasible, politically acceptable. And that is where the problem lies. That is where, in the difficulty of making direct income taxation of individuals besides companies politically acceptable. That's what needs to be achieved, and that's not yet been tackled. I would add that a major problem for the future and the stability of the oil-producing countries is the increasing gap between extremely wealthy elite and the vast majority of the people. And I speak of the nationals, not just of expatriates. There is a growing income and wealth divide, which is, in the long run, I believe, unacceptable. And we know out of the experience of all countries, including the OECD countries, that in the absence of significant income taxation and wealth taxation, for that matter, this gap is going to grow. And it is a problem that we have in all our countries, and it's the other source of populist reaction and behavior on the part of the electorate.
So Radia, when you talk about rationalization of energy prices, that actually is key to improve energy productivity. How do you deal with some of those issues that Giacomo mentioned?
Yeah. Actually, I agree with Giacomo looking to what the OECD countries have developed and looking from the perspective of the Arab countries, where basically we cannot classify them all in the same level, with the wealthy countries having, I would say, small population and huge resources in terms of oil and gas, at least in terms of potential production, and those who do not even with a high cost of production, but also low spare capacity, with the growing population, also a bigger land. So basically, the rationalization, it needs really a mechanism where the income tax could be, I would say, an instrument to apply, but we need to be very careful in terms of how we define it and at which level and how to identify the different kind of populations that we want to, I would say, target. I think the rationalization come much more from the upstream side, looking how to the best use of the resources in terms of looking to the industries, the whole value chain, and how to basically first impose, not question of taxes, but how to impose investment in terms of the energy efficiency at the industry level, but also changing the consumer behavior through taxation as well, which could be a solution. But I would say there are other mechanisms that can be like through, I would say, certain examples that were also used where you have funding mechanism directly, you compensate those who are at lower income. But what we need to be careful here, usually most of the research, and I was reading when looking to energy vulnerability in terms of for rationalization of prices, identify that usually we say you remove subsidy, then you impact those who have lowest revenues. But in reality, what we are going to move, and we need to be very careful in terms of taxation, that the middle class population, they will be the most impacted. And for this, so basically we need to have to completely review the structure of the economy. So whatever you do a system, you would have a compensation mechanism in the front. And it cannot be directly money given directly, but it should be much more people can find a different way to increase their revenues. At the same time, the energy should be at its real cost and not a simple commodity.
Dr. Adnan, you have something?
Yeah, I think I agree, but I want to illustrate a few examples. Let's take the case of a country, an oil-producing country that has been highly dependent on oil revenues to drive social welfare. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and others. And it's becoming very clear that this is not sustainable. So you want to move away. You want to do economic reforms that are based on energy reforms. You want to move away from subsidies. But the population are against it. Even a country where you have 100% democracy in Kuwait, the parliament is always against energy price reforms. Although they recognize that this is good for the country at large, but they say, they almost always point out, says, the burden is going to come on the low income and the middle income. Because the low income and middle income is now enjoying a lot of benefits from the government, almost free electricity, almost free housing, whatever it is. And so that's the key lesson, is that you should not drive policies without thinking ahead that the people will share in the benefits. And you have to demonstrate to them that they are sharing in the benefit. So your policy, for the sake of the country, you want to change course, so you want new policies. Obviously, the current energy subsidy in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries in particular, but even in Egypt and other places, is not sustainable. But when you move away from that policy, you save for the state's benefits, right? That benefit has to be shared somehow equitably, or at least it has to be perceived that saving that generated from the reform is perceived for the benefit of the people. Let's give you a concrete example. In Kuwait, if the country remove electricity subsidy, there will be tremendous saving to the states. But there will be tremendous pain for the people who are now getting the electricity zero. Okay? So you've got to devise something to convince them of that. Counter examples from OECD countries. Energiewende in Germany. Germany wanted to move to low carbon, to renewable. So they designed all kind of policies, feed-in tariff, subsidies, and all of that. And but everybody participated in it and accepted it, at least for a time being. Today, if you look at the success or failure of this energy policy in Germany, what do you see? You see that Germany has managed to generate almost 20% of electricity renewable, even more than that. More than 20%, more than 20%. But what is it based on? It's based on wind capacity that's almost 55% of peak demand, and solar capacity that's almost close to 50% of peak demand. So when you put the two together, between wind and solar in Germany today, you have 105, 110 capacity, renewable capacity, but it generates only 20%. Obviously, any economist would tell you this must come at a cost. Who's paying for that cost? The ratepayer. The ratepayer, so far, has been happy to do that. Although the cost of electricity or the price of electricity in Europe, in Germany, is more than 50% on average of the rest of the OECD countries around it. But the consumers are happy to do it. The industry may be not so happy to do it, but there has been a sort of a campaign. So this is almost like driven by the people, this policy. So far, the pain maybe will be too painful later on. They may rebel against it. In France, they couldn't wait 1 week. They went to the streets. Because, no, this is the point. Because in France, they did not prepare them for it. In France, in the 70s, they pushed a nuclear power policy as a way to fulfill their energy security. And it was sold to the people. And so France ended up having almost 80% of its power coming from nuclear. Now, this support to that policy is on the waning, following Fukushima, and they haven't found an alternate yet for it. So the bottom line, what I'm trying to say is that in this world and in this time and age, you cannot just simply choose the optimum policy. If you think there is one, there's none. There's always a penultimate because we don't know all of the factors. But it has to be sold to the people, and importantly, the consequences of that policy should be shared, and it should be perceived as fair and equitable.
Thank you, Dr. Okay, Radia, but very quickly, because I would like to open... no, please go ahead.
No, I just want to say that affordability, talking about Germany today, working with our colleague from the UN Europe. I mean, Germany is considered now with the one much more impacting to citizens in terms of affordability, given this. But I think multi-stakeholder approach should be prevailed when it comes to communication in terms of rationalization of prices. And I guess we do have certain examples in the Arab region, mostly Morocco, for example, with the work they are doing. But the thing that it's not a question about oil price only, it's also about water. And this needs to be taken into consideration when talking about subsidies.
Before I open, the floor for question from the floor, Dr. Majid, I would like to ask you, we've seen, certain countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, improving energy efficiency going into increasing the gas, the share of gas, but at the same time, they're also pursuing the petrochemical industry because they see that this is actually one way that the oil industry actually can generate forward linkages, backward linkages. But at the same time, we're seeing all of the other Arab exporters also doing the same. Are you concerned that this is actually one of the routes that actually may not pay off in the longer term? What are your views on that?
I think if you want to diversify, you start with your comparative advantage. All countries have to do that. And the comparative advantage of our countries would start with your oil and gas. But you don't have to stop there. You have to go further downstream into chemicals. We started with basic chemicals, basic petrochemicals, but now we are trying to invest heavily into specialty chemicals. So the start point, and each country, have it, whether it's like UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so on, they have to start with their comparative advantage. Their comparative advantage starts with petrochemicals or energy intensive. But they should not stop there. They should go further. They should adopt an industrial policy that goes beyond the current comparative advantage and go into the dynamic advantages into industries that add value, that provide create jobs, and hopefully will pay jobs for the national workforce, and also, technology that needs investments into R&D that we've been lacking. And to now, luckily, into this area, we are the only region that is investing heavily into crude to chemicals technology. That is not to go through the refinery. We are investing, there's a joint venture between Aramco and SABIC now. It's a $1 billion so far. Investment is still in the research phase, but once it's commercialized, this will be we're cooperating with research institutions in Stanford and MIT and so on to make that technology. So we also have to invest in R&D to utilize our comparative advantage. But since I have the mic, there was a lot of talk that there is a resistance to energy price reform. We have to start from the premise that energy prices are ridiculously low in our region. They are the lowest worldwide. True, when you enact an energy price reform, it would, and if you don't take care of the distributional, it will not succeed. But other countries have done so. They have adjusted their energy prices, where electricity, gasoline, diesel, gas, and so on. At the same time, they put in place not all the savings coming from the energy price reform goes to the government. It is channeled back to the people along certain criteria. Some countries, they will just give it back to the people, like I think Iran did that. In our case, we had eligibility criteria. We call it citizens account, where people register into that account, and then depending on their level of income and the impact of the energy price reform had on their budget or on the household budget, they get compensated. So there are so many mechanisms that have been tried in Indonesia, in Mexico, everywhere, that you enact a price reform, but at the same time, you have you put in place a compensation mechanism.
But that very much depends on how the population perceive the credibility of the government in doing that. Hopefully one day in Lebanon we'll implement something similar. Okay, so let's open the floor for question. Any questions? Please introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Walid Marouche from Lebanese American University, economist. I want to pick up on Dr. Majid and Dr. Adnan's comments about energy subsidies. So we know that energy subsidies are usually regressive, so they have the rich more than the poor. But it seems our policymakers and politicians in the Middle East, they always package and sell these subsidies as policies that are pro-poor. So perception here matters a lot. And I think that the policymakers and the politicians have the most important role to play if the reforms are to be successful. So what are your thoughts on that, about the regressivity of the subsidies, energy subsidies?
Let me take two more questions and then Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you, Ahmed Atiqa, CEO of the Arab Petroleum Investment Corporation. I think we'll be remiss if we have Dr. Majid and Dr. Adnan with us with their long association with OPEC and not ask them about OPEC. And Dr. Adnan alluded briefly to the idiosyncrasies of OPEC, particularly in this day and age. And I was wondering if you could shed light on the current situation of OPEC with regard to withdrawal of Qatar, the pressure from the US, people saying OPEC may not be needed anymore, etc. Just a quick input on that would be appreciated.
Dr. Ahmed, that's such a very easy question and simple question. Thank you, you know. I'll take one more question. We have time for one more question, and then I'll let the panel conclude. Here, please, Mustafa. Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'll give you more questions.
Mustafa Ansari, Senior Economist at Ecopa Petroleum Investments Corporation. I'd like to just follow up on the question of our colleague here as well on the subsidy reform. I completely agree. I think the communication is the most important aspect for me personally that has been missing or has not been executed fully when it comes to reform in the region, and above all, the transparency of what would be done with the sort of the savings that are generated from the reforms. And I think you mentioned sort of going from one extreme to the other, from reforming subsidies to introducing taxes as far as carbon savings are concerned. So I was wondering on the sort of carbon taxes, how would you go about imposing them, utilizing the communication aspect? Because it would seem to me that by imposing a carbon tax, you're kind of ensuring that the industry would be forced to invest in either cleaning up the way they produce to ensure that their demand is sustained, and or at the same time perhaps reduce demand because the prices might be elevated. It seems like a win-win situation, especially given the number of NOCs. Is it that simple, or is there something that we're missing here?
Okay, I'll take. I'll take one more question from the back, just to be fair.
Thank you very much. I'm Wafa Abul Husn from ESQA, Radia's colleague from the Statistics Division Department. Although we are very pleased to be here, and just to highlight some points on the CO2 emissions that from the transport sector and from the extraction sector. You mentioned, Dr. Adnan, that for the transport sector, maybe putting on individual cars, using technology for carbon capture. Just to rethink the transport sector, it's for the final energy consumption, it's the highest sector in final energy consumption and, of course, CO2 emissions. So we have to rethink the transport sector and, looking at public transportation and all the other means, that rather than using individual, looking at emissions in that sense. So this is one thing. And what you said on the oil and gas optimization, there is a case, of course, when you look at the life cycle of the production. Many, even in Germany, like producing from windmills and transporting all the way from the north to the south, not looking at the energy, use in the whole process, is against the use of renewables in that sense. So the life cycle and the processes to produce the clean energy, I think, will give a case to the oil and gas. So this is another thing, using the life cycle of the product. And finally, having transparent statistics. So you know that we have problems in producing statistics on oil in the region. Exports, there's no balance when you look at the energy flows altogether. So there are problems in the exports, there are problems in the final energy consumption. And when you want to come and look at policies, and when the statistics are not there, it's very difficult for the public to look at if the energy policies are right, and for the government to put their policies right. So that's why we have a workshop next week on energy statistics at ESQA.
Thank you. Okay. I think because we're running out of time, I'm going to just take those 4 questions. Hopefully the discussion will continue to the next session. So let me start with Dr. Majid and the easiest question on OPEC, Qatar, US shale, Trump, all of that, basically. How is that shaping? Quite exciting times.
No, but Sam, I was going to throw this question to you. Because you just in Oxford, you published something on this, I think.
Yes.
I just before I came, I looked at what you had published, and I probably I'll tell you what I do.
But
Actually,
I'm the chair of the panel, so I don't need to
have
answer
you
any questions.
probably summarize what you had something the options, and then I'll take it from you on this particular one.
I want to shift it to me.
There were other questions that I was that were addressed to me. It was about as a matter of fact two questions. I think the energy prices in the whole region, especially the oil and gas producers of the region, of the MENA region, were unsustainable. There was no way that we could continue. There was no way that we could continue, whether prices to the consumers, even prices to the industry and to the commercial sector. With electricity prices so cheap, you've got, the commercial sector was actually living on subsidies, and some of the industry. So it was unsustainable. It is not whether we should have a energy price reform, it's how you do it. Whether you do it across the board, and then you take this as a gain to the government that's added to the revenue side of the budget, or you recycle that gain from the energy price reform back into the economy. So it goes back, it should be going back into the economy. Either goes back into the sector, like what we did in Saudi Arabia. We set up an electricity fund that is to invest into new generation capacity. What we gained from the tariff, it went into that particular fund for the diesel and gas and so on. As I said, we had to do this compensation mechanism, the citizens' account. So a price reform is needed for efficiency. Sectoral efficiency, and we really had waste. And in the case of the GCC, we had inter-GCC tahrib, smuggling. There was smuggling between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, between Saudi Arabia and UAE, and for Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and so on. So you've got the smuggling and efficiencies everywhere. The Jordanians were complaining of this. So a price reform was needed, but it is how you do it. And that was really a critical part. It took us more than 3 years to come up with some formula that is acceptable. And also we had to go into the communication. The population has to be convinced that this in their long-term interest, and it will not impact them equally across the board. It will not impact those in the high-income strata. The high-income strata will bear the whole burden, but the low-income strata will be compensated. So they know that they do not pay effectively the same as, so we had to go through that communication mechanism. Of course, we had problems. In the first enactment of the program, we should have done more, but actually we tried over 3 years time to do it gradually. The first year we've done an increase, then we had another increase, and when we felt that the third increase might lead to had an impact on GDP growth, we delayed that one. So you also have to be flexible. The good thing about the economies of the GCC, unlike other economies of MENA when they are forced to do it by the IMF stabilization program and so on, in our case and the case of Kuwait and the UAE, we don't have to go through this. We are doing it because it's part of our own reform program and it's not imposed by an IMF or anything else. But on the other, that's not.
Thank you.
I'm not shying away from addressing this, but I'll start. You start with your paper,
No,
and I'll take up.
Giacomo, perhaps you can, say something briefly on the carbon tax, and then I will ask Adnan to conclude with the CO2 and transport.
Yes, I will gladly say something about the carbon tax. In fact, it's interesting how the whole discussion about subsidies is almost fitting into the discussion on the carbon tax. So there is a continuum about the two things. And the same thing has to be said. It is obvious that imposing a carbon tax would need simultaneously compensatory measures of income redistribution. I feel, ill at ease because this happens to be the proposal that has come out of a prominent conservative think tank and group in the United States, that has been proposing the introduction of a carbon tax, and the proceeds would be redistributed to all citizens in equal installments, okay? I'm sorry that they proposed it, but I happen to think that they are right, and so for once I will support the conservative line in the United States. Why is a carbon tax not popular with European governments, especially of governments in general, or for that matter with environmentalists? Because in fact, in my opinion, they are not genuinely or exclusively concerned about emissions. They are concerned about several other things. A carbon tax would show that nuclear energy is a commercially viable way of addressing decarbonization. And they don't want to see that. They want to eliminate nuclear energy. A carbon tax would kill coal. And they don't want to kill coal. There is a commission today in Germany at work to establish a final date for phasing out coal. They cannot agree. And the Energiewende is not producing a reduction in emissions because they are still relying on coal, increasingly relying on coal. So a carbon tax would show that it is not just a matter of using fossil fuels, but how you use them and how you produce them. All of these things are not really welcomed by governments and not welcomed by many environmentalists. So that's why it's highly controversial. But if humankind wants to be serious about curbing emissions and limiting climate change, a carbon tax is the universal global carbon tax is the only way to go about it.
Yeah, but Giacomo, that creates distributional issues which we're not going to touch on. Dr. Adnan, the last word for you and the last questions on the transport and CO2.
What was the question exactly? I didn't get it. You said something about life cycle, right?
Yeah, the life cycle, and that actually makes the case for oil and gas.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I agree with you in principle fully. Whenever we want to approach any problem, we should not describe only part of the problem. If we are going to calculate the cost of energy that is on equal footing, we should focus not on the initial cost, but we should focus on the total cost, and whether we're talking the economic or the CO2 or what have you. And it's true that a lot of the technologies that are being proposed are not looking at the total cost. Let me give you an example of electric vehicles. Obviously, electric vehicles will never be successful unless you succeed in building a low-cost, high-density, fast-charging battery, okay? And the reason that is because currently liquid hydrocarbon energy density is at least 20 times the density of the batteries in terms of being able to generate. It used to be 50, but now they have made tremendous development in batteries. But what is being ignored is not only the energy density, you have to look at the total CO2 emission for all of what goes into the car, whether it is internal combustion engine or whether it is battery. And in the case of electric vehicles, you have to look at all of what goes on in producing the electrons that are being stored into the battery. And in Norway, if they have hydropower, it makes a lot of sense to have your fleet essentially electric, because you are using renewable with very little. I mean, of course, even hydro has a CO2 emission, because you have to figure out how much CO2 went into producing the cement that you used in order to generate the dams, and then you have to sort of account for it for 60 or 100 years, the lifetime of the dam and what have you, just exaggerating a little bit. But you're absolutely right, this is not being done. And maybe Giacomo pointed out to why, because obviously everybody in the energy sector has an agenda, and that agenda sometimes become ideological. And we are also guilty of it, you know, let's not absolve ourselves. But at least we should be willing to talk about it. Carbon emission from hydrocarbon is there, nobody denies it. There are ways to reduce it, but to say that alternatives are essentially carbon-free is wrong, especially if you have electric vehicles in cities. The main reasons you are putting them in cities is not because you are producing them from wind. You are producing them from coal power plants like in China, but you are using them in the cities because you want to reduce the local pollution in the cities. So you're basically moving the source of the pollution from the city to the outskirts. And stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Adnan. I would like to apologize for eating into your coffee break 10 minutes, so I apologize for that, but the discussion was flowing very nicely. So all is left for me is to thank the panelists. No, for the coffee break.
Thank you, Bassam.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you,
It has been a
Bassam. Thank
privilege.
you, panelists, for an excellent discussion. Just before we go for the coffee break, two announcements. The password for the Wi-Fi has been updated. There was a mistake in it. You have been given evaluation forms. Please do give them back before leaving. And the third thing is that all the sessions are being videotaped. They will be uploaded to the AUB YouTube channel as of tomorrow. Thank you all very much. The coffee break is right through this door. Thanks.